From 1993 to 1996, over half a dozen new game consoles launched across the world. These systems had 32-bit and 64-bit CPUs. They supported CD-ROMs for more storage and higher quality music than previous systems could ever achieve. The era of the 16-bit juggernauts, the Genesis and the Super Nintendo, was coming to an end. While these game consoles were discontinued, their legacy has only grown in the 2 decades following their prime. Thanks to the advent of the internet and a growing appreciation for video game history, the legacy of these two consoles continues to grow. This is the story of the Great Console War between Sega and Nintendo. In the finale of this series, we'll be taking a look at the final days of the Genesis, Super Nintendo, Game Boy and Game Gear, and many other consoles. We'll also be discussing the legacy of these systems and how they influenced the game industry. The 1996 holiday season was dominated by the PlayStation, Saturn, and Nintendo 64. But the Genesis and SNES weren't done just yet. In North America, both systems moved over 1 million units in 1996, with Europe and Japan contributing further sales for both consoles. Going into 1997, all eyes were on a new generation of consoles rather than the last generation. In North America, the Genesis and Game Gear were all discontinued by the end of 1997. New software was still being published for the Genesis in North America in 1997. In March, a port of Virtua Fighter 2 hit the Genesis, giving the console one final in-house developed Sega game. The final game published by Sega for the system was Jurassic Park: The Lost World. Based on the Steven Spielberg movie of the same name, The Lost World came out on September 16, 1997, over 2 years after the release of the Sega Saturn. In North America, Sega sold the licensing rights for the Genesis hardware to a company called Majesco. In 1998, a new model of the Genesis called the Genesis 3 was out on store shelves. Unlike the first two models, the Genesis 3 was incompatible with many of the Genesis accessories, including the Sega CD and 32X. Majesco also acquired many unsold Sega Genesis cartridges and Model 2 systems that they sold at budgeted prices. Majesco ended production of the Genesis 3 in 1999, bringing an end to the Genesis in the 3 major game markets. In Brazil, however, Tectoy acquired the license to the Genesis and continues to sell emulated versions of Genesis hardware and software in the country. The Game Gear's library was largely complete by the end of 1996, as Sega shifted their focus solely to the Sega Saturn. The final first-party release for the system was the same as the Genesis, Jurassic Park: The Lost World. Production on a successor to the Game Gear was considered by Sega at the time, but the company opted against it, fearing they wouldn't be able to match the success of the Game Boy. Like the Genesis, the Game Gear was revitalized as a budget console by Majesco after Sega ended official production of the console. A budget version of the Game Gear hit store shelves in 2000, with a handful of additional games being released for the system for $15 each. The final official release on the Game Gear came out in 2001 and was published by Majesco. Super Battle Tank, a port of the Super Nintendo and Genesis original, finished off the Game Gear's library. The Super Nintendo received a new model in 1997 called the New Style Super NES. This slimmed-down SNES retailed for $99.99, with some models including Yoshi's Island as a pack-in game. A similar redesign for the Super Famicom was available in Japan under the name Super Famicom Jr. Nintendo's final first-party release for the Super Nintendo wasn't far off, however. On November 27, 1997, Kirby's Dream Land 3 hit North American shelves, roughly a year after the release of the Nintendo 64. A Japanese release followed in March of 1998. The final game released for the Super Nintendo was a port of Frogger, released on October 6, 1998. Published by Majesco Entertainment, this was also the final Sega Genesis game officially released in North America. The Super Nintendo was officially discontinued in North America in 1999, 8 years after the console made its debut in the region. The Super Famicom had more staying power in Japan, where Sega was never able to get a foothold in the region. Rewritable flash cartridges called Nintendo Power were available for the system in the late 90s. Alongside the Satellaview service, new releases for the Super Famicom came out as late as 2000. The final game released on a cartridge in the region was Fire Emblem Thachia 776 on January 26, 2000. The Super Famicom was discontinued in 2003 after sitting atop the Japanese market for 13 years. Nintendo also discontinued the Famicom at this time, bringing an end to the system's historic 20-year life. The Game Boy remained in production far longer than its rivals or console counterparts. Plans for a successor to the system were in place in the mid-1990s with an intended release date of 1996. Codenamed Project Atlantis, this Game Boy successor would have featured a 32-bit processor and a full-color LCD screen. The project was dropped due to cost concerns. Instead, Nintendo spent the rest of the 90s releasing new models of the Game Boy. In 1998, the Game Boy Light was released exclusively in Japan. This revision added a light to the screen, a requested feature for much of the Game Boy's lifespan. At the end of 1998, a pseudo-successor to the Game Boy was released worldwide, called the Game Boy Color. The new system didn't feature any hardware revisions that made it more powerful than the original Game Boy on a technical level. The Game Boy Color's main selling point was in the name, Color. After 9 years, Nintendo finally released a handheld with color support. All Game Boy games were backwards compatible with the Game Boy Color, with some titles even being released on black cartridges. These games were designed in color for the Game Boy Color, but were playable on the original Game Boy as well. New software continued to hit the Game Boy throughout the late 90s. In February 1997, Nintendo published Mole Mania for the system, one of the final gray cartridges for the system. Produced by Shigeru Miyamoto, Mole Mania is considered a hidden gem by many Game Boy enthusiasts today. The biggest games for the original Game Boy were, of course, Pokemon Red and Blue, when they were released in the United States in 1998. Pokemania quickly swept the nation, and additional releases followed. The final original Game Boy game released was Pokemon Yellow in Japan in 1998. A North American release followed in 1999, and Europe received the game in 2000. Officially, the Game Boy was not discontinued until 2003, although by this point, the original Game Boy was replaced with the new Game Boy Color system. With Sega and Nintendo's war over, it might seem difficult to find a winner between the two. Sega's dominance over Europe and North America for a large portion of the 16-bit era ended Nintendo's stranglehold on the region and cleared the path for future challengers with PlayStation and Xbox. Unfortunately for Sega, they were never able to topple Nintendo's grip over the Japanese market. The Super Famicom remained the dominant console in the region during its entire run. In the end, Sega sold a total of 30 million Genesis and Mega Drive units worldwide. For the Super Nintendo, sales were strong in all regions. 49 million Super Famicom and Super Nintendo units were sold worldwide. Roughly 20 million units were sold in Japan and North America each, with the remaining units coming primarily from Western European countries. From a sales perspective, the Super Nintendo held off Sega's attempt to control the console market, but they did so with one major caveat. Had it not been for the Super Famicom's success in Japan, the Genesis would have sold better or tied with the Super Nintendo in most markets. On the handheld front, the Game Gear sold an impressive 10 million units, beating out Atari and NEC. This pales in comparison with the Game Boy, however. It's estimated that roughly 70 million original Game Boys were sold between the system's launch in 1989 and the release of the Game Boy Color. Nintendo's official records put the Game Boy's lifetime sales at 118 million. This made the Game Boy the first gaming system to ever cross 100 million units sold, and is currently the third best-selling game system of all time, behind the PS2 and Nintendo DS. However, it should be noted that the 118 million number combines both original Game Boy and Game Boy Color sales. NEC, Atari, SNK, Philips, and the 3DO company all failed to make a dramatic impact in sales when compared to Sega and Nintendo. None of their systems managed to sell more than 10 million units worldwide. Of the group, NEC was the most successful, with the TurboGrafx 16 taking a distant third in the console race. The Turbo Express, on the other hand, never took off, in part due to its high price point. SNK's Neo Geo system managed to outlast its competitors, although it was never really in competition with them. Neo Geo's final release, Samurai Showdown 5 Special, released on April 22, 2004. The Neo Geo was officially discontinued after the release of this title. The Neo Geo CD was discontinued in 1997, and altogether, the Neo Geo sold roughly 1 million units across the world. Atari and the 3DO company were hit the worst. Atari Corporation saw only a few million Atari Lynx sell, and the Jaguar bombed with less than 500,000 units sold worldwide. After failing to reclaim the glory days of Atari, Atari Corporation merged with JTS Incorporated in 1996. In 1998, JTS sold the licensing and name rights for Atari to Hasbro. The 3DO performed better than Atari's Jaguar, but it didn't do much good for the young company. After discontinuing the 3DO in 1997, the 3DO company became a third-party publisher. The company was officially dissolved in 2003 when they filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. 3DO's assets were then auctioned off to a variety of different corporations. The CDI didn't fare much better, but Philips was able to weather the unit's losses. The CDI was officially discontinued in 1998, and Philips has never made another game console. In the years following the discontinuation of the 4th generation of systems, many of the most notable games made their ways to new hardware and new audiences. Sega started off by porting Genesis Sonic games to the Sega Saturn in 1997 with the compilation pack Sonic Jam. Sega continued to re-release Genesis-era Sonic games during the 6th generation of gaming. Other classic Genesis games began seeing ports during this era as well, one of the most notable releases being the Sega Genesis collection for PlayStation 2 and PSP. By the 7th generation of gaming, multiple Genesis titles were re-released on the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and Wii. The advent of digital downloads meant classic games no longer had to be compiled on a single disc or cartridge to see a re-release. Super Nintendo games quickly found a home on Nintendo's Game Boy Advance following the handheld's release in 2001. Classics like Super Mario World and The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past saw new light on the system, with additional features being added to the titles. Super Nintendo games were re-released on the Wii Virtual Console shortly after the Wii's launch in 2006. 74 games were released for the Wii Virtual Console in North America, with the final few games coming out in 2012 before the launch of the Wii U. Additionally, TurboGrafx 16, Neo Geo, and Genesis games were available for download on the Virtual Console service, with 75 Genesis games, 54 Neo Geo games, and 63 TurboGrafx titles being released. Super Nintendo games were also released on the Wii U and 3DS Virtual Consoles, although the 3DS Virtual Console was limited to the new line of 3DS systems. Today, Super Nintendo games and Genesis titles are playable on the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and Nintendo Switch, and it seems likely that these classics will make their way to the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X in due time. Genesis games are also available for download on mobile devices and PC services like Steam. In 2017, Nintendo unveiled and released the Super Nintendo Classic Edition. Retailing for $79.99, the SNES Classic is a mini console with 21 pre-installed Super Nintendo games. The Classic included many hit games, and included the first official release of Star Fox 2, a previously unreleased sequel to the 1993 original. Sega followed Nintendo's footsteps with their own release in 2019. The Sega Genesis Mini launched for $79.99 and included 42 Genesis games. Included in the release was a Sega Genesis version of Tetris, a title that was never released on the original hardware. In 2020, Sega announced plans to continue their line of mini consoles with multiple Sega Game Gear Micros. So far, the Game Gear Micros have seen 5 variations released in Japan, with each one containing a different set of games. The legacy of these consoles has lasted for more than 2 decades and will likely continue as the game industry grows older. I've had a blast playing both my Super Nintendo and Genesis. My Super Nintendo was the first game console I ever had after it was gifted to me by my cousin. It's the same console I received on Christmas Day in 2002, with many of my favorite games from my childhood still being in my collection. I didn't join the Sega Genesis party until later, but I've loved the classics on this system too. Rocket Knight Adventures is one of my favorite platformers, and I can't wait to dive deeper into the system's library of games in the years to come. The Great Console War pitted executives against one another. It caused lines to be drawn in the sand across playgrounds around the world. In an era before widespread use of the internet, the rivalry between Sega and Nintendo was a part of mainstream culture. No other generation of consoles has seen quite the level of love for their respective sides since, despite gaming growing more and more popular. And today, Sega and Nintendo are on good terms. The era of trying to one-up each other is over, and an era of mutual respect endures. That's the legacy of the Great Console War. That's the legacy of Sega versus Nintendo. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the Great Console War, the story of Sega versus Nintendo. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like and share the video on your favorite social media sites. In the comments, I want to know your thoughts on Sega, Nintendo, or any of the other companies and products featured in this series. Be sure to subscribe to catch the next video as soon as it releases, and be sure to let me know what types of games or systems you would like to see covered in future videos. And, once again, thank you for watching.